Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thanks for your interest and your support of the Griot Institute programming. This is the fourth in a series of lectures on Jonestown Reconsidered. I'm Rebecca Willoughby. I'm the Assistant Director of the Griot Institute for Africana Studies, and I'd like to thank a couple people who were not able to be here with us tonight, but who made this happen. One of them is Professor Carmen Gillespie, who created this series and the course that goes with it. Another is Bridget Newell, who is our Associate Provost for Diversity, and Thomas Alexander, who is our Provost for Diversity. Without them, we couldn't do the programming that we do, so I'd like to thank them. The Griot Institute has as its focus collaborative faculty, student, and staff intellectual and creative investigations of the cultures, histories, literatures, peoples, arts, and events of Africana communities. We embrace narrative as a thematic and theoretical framework for our programming and projects. And in the service of these goals, tonight the Griot Institute welcomes Jordan Vilchez as she discusses her narrative and her relationship to Jonestown. To introduce her, I'm privileged to present Coralyn Davis, Professor and Director of Women's and Gender Studies here at Bucknell.
Thank you. I'm happy to see you all here this evening. I know it's really close to break, so I think any student who's showing up for anything at this point gets extra points. So I'm delighted to introduce to you Jordan Vilchez, who's going to speak to us this evening about the lives of young people in the People's Temple. Ms. Vilchez's visit, as you probably know, is part of the university's celebration of Black History Month, a celebration in blue, and the Griot Institute for Africana Studies, Jonestown Reconsidered 35 years later, series of events. As indicated on the website, Alternative Considerations of Jonestown and People's Temple, sponsored by the Department of Religious Studies at San Diego State University, Jonestown is a word with several meanings. First, it refers to an agricultural project established by the People's Temple, a religious group based in California, which moved to Guyana in the late 1970s to establish a religious utopia. Second, it refers to the events of November 18, 1978, in which a U.S. congressman was assassinated, along with 4 other individuals at a jungle airstrip. These tragic killings were followed by the mass suicide murders of 900 men, women, and children by ingesting potassium cyanide mixed into a vat of punch and tranquilizers. Third, the word Jonestown has been used to describe any new religious movement which may or may not have the potential for violence. Ms. Vilchez became a member of the People's Temple at age 12 when she moved to Redwood Valley with her older sister, Diane. During her time in the temple, she became a part of the inner workings of the organization and was sent to Guyana when she was 20. She was on the planning commission and is familiar with many of the inner workings of the organization. Ms. Vilchez fortuitously missed being among those who died on November 18th by leaving Jonestown the day before to attend to duties in the capital, but her sister and nephews perished. She's contributed her writing to yearly editions of the Jonestown Report. Ms. Vilchez has written, quote, "It wasn't until 2007 when I entertained the idea that my own current personal reality may be in an extreme way influenced by the belief system under which I developed as a child and teenager. The perpetual climate of fear, doom, and gloom in my early formative years in People's Temple and its eventual tragic ending when I was 21 has reverberated in ways that I've only begun to understand. Because of what we have been told and shown, we were in a state of perpetual readiness to defend our ideals and principles of racial and gender equality. working class pride, humanitarianism, and social justice for all. I still believe these to be worthy ideals. Yet as I look back in retrospective and thoughtful analysis, I also believe the price of this for me and other young people was enormous." Unquote. Today, Ms. Vilchez lives in California and has an integrative mentoring practice called Cosmology of You in Berkeley. Her current work, she has stated, entails an integral life coaching process from the perspective of our being part of and embedded within a larger journey of cosmos and earth in a continual process of unfolding. The work combines conversation, art, and body work to assist people who are dealing with life transitions, grief, and loss, as well as people who need assistance in figuring out their next move. It is meaningful for me to assist others to step into their own empowerment, to joyfully live the lives they are inspired to live. It is with pleasure that I introduce to you Jordan Vilchez.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here as a guest of Bucknell and the Griot Institute. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this in-depth look at Jonestown and People's Temple, which was a huge part of my life and always will be. What I'll do is tell you how I became involved in People's Temple using an account that I've written for succinctness. After that, we can open it up for discussion and questions. That sounds okay? Each person's experience of People's Temple is different. So I also brought with me as well some notes of conversations that I've had recently with two of my friends who were also in People's Temple, and I will share them with you. In the summer of 1969, I was 12 years old. A family friend invited my mother, my two sisters, and my two very small nephews and I to a temple meeting in Redwood Valley. Redwood Valley, as you probably know, is in Northern California. Our friend was very enthusiastic as she told us about how the people were friendly and happy, and she was excited because the leader, Jim Jones, was talking about equality among all people and that it was all integrated. This was appealing to my mother, a Berkeley progressive, and although she wasn't church-oriented, the atmosphere itself was a political statement and absolutely unique. There were church songs mixed in with songs like "We Shall Overcome," which is a common political song. There were, the appearance of joy and unity overshadowed any questions my mother may have had about the healings that Jim Jones claimed to be performing. Instantly, I made lots of friends and enjoyed swimming in the big indoor pool that was in the back of the church. Very shortly after that, it was decided that I would live with my older sister, Diane, who had decided to join the temple with her two small children and live in Redwood Valley. My mother didn't join, but would visit from time to time. I went to Redwood Valley Junior High and Ukiah High School afterwards. Temple kids hung out together as it was not permitted to become friends with non-members. As kids, though, a few outside friends were made. After about a year, I was placed in one of the church communes, and over the course of 5 years, lived in 3 different communes, which were very highly organized, and everyone seemed to get along really well. There was a tendency in the temple to break families up, so that one's primary allegiance would be to the cause, which for Jim Jones actually meant allegiance to him. One evening after one of the Wednesday night meetings, which was a meeting of close members, these meetings would go on until midnight. I was called back after going home to one of the communes that I was living in. I was called back to join the planning commission. I was 16 and the youngest person in this group. This is where the logistics were talked about, trips planned, and it was also a way for Jim Jones to keep further control over people. The Planning Commission, or also known as PC, was considered the more trusted, the members were considered the more trusted members, although several, over the course of time, did defect. During this time, I was so tired during school that I don't actually know how I got good grades. Part of it may have been excuse me, due to the fact that 2 of the high school teachers were members of the church. At 18, I moved into the San Francisco Temple when we started moving out of Redwood Valley and alternating weekends between San Francisco and Los Angeles. We would go on 12 Greyhound buses. My temple duties included greeting newcomers and getting their names and addresses and other information prior to coming into the meetings. There were several of us that did this, and the purpose of this task was to let the innermost staff and Jim know who was there and something about who they were and what they did. It was also a way of screening out individuals who were perceived as possibly not a good fit or a possible enemy or spy. Other duties I had were counting money after offerings, processing requests from individuals in the communes, and doing security shifts. In July of 1977, I was sent to Guyana. When I arrived in Jonestown, I worked in the fields planting bananas, I think. Bananas and cassava, a root. I knew pretty much right away that I didn't like being there. I really enjoyed the country and the people, but in Jonestown we really didn't see the people. So what I did was I figured out a way to be in the capital, which is where we had a house and where a lot of the transactions took place for getting supplies and bringing them into Jonestown. The job I came up for myself was one in which I would walk around town and present what we were doing in the interior and doing a spiel about the agricultural project and asking for money. when I think about that now, I think that it was pretty ridiculous to be in a foreign country asking for their money. But I didn't know better, and I was young, and it was a way to not be in Jonestown. And so I presented the idea to Jim. He liked it, and I was trusted quite a bit. So he said okay, and I got to spend most of my time after that in the capital, Georgetown. When the tragedy happened, I had just, right before it happened, I had just come back in from being in Georgetown doing this job, and I was supposed to be in Jonestown when it happened. What people would do their job, and people had different jobs in the capital, getting supplies and whatnot. But after a time, you would always have to come back so that you wouldn't get too much of a taste of the outside and then maybe decide you wanted to leave. So I had just come back, and I really should not have been able to leave again, but something made me go to his cabin and knock on the door and ask if I could go out again on the next, well, there was a boat, tractor ride to a port, and then a boat ride down the river, and then a little part that was ocean, and then the dock in Georgetown. So he said I could, and I left, and that's why I survived. I think there's several reasons why he said it was okay. I think that by that time he was really preoccupied about the congressman coming in, and trusted me, and he was probably heavily drugged as well, which is something that people didn't really know about and probably suspected. Get a sip of water here. Okay, so you read a little part that I was going to read, so let's see where I might pick up. So, as was stated, almost 30 years later, I began to really kind of get a sense that there were some ways that growing up in People's Temple really affected me that I didn't really know before. And mainly what I'm talking about is just a sense of gloom and just unease generally, like something could happen at any time, and that whatever it wasn't going to be good. And so I guess in a way it's like having some amount of post-trauma. You know, it's not really bad, but there's something that's there. So when I first joined, there was talk about a nuclear bomb, and Jim would tell us that it was going to drop at 3:09 because apparently he prophesied that time. And so some of the things that we did were like eat a whole bunch of dry soybeans because apparently that would protect us from radioactive fallout. By the time I was 18 and living in the temple, the focus of fear was different. It was the 70s and the global political scene was hot. As Jim Jones reminded us almost every week, the Chilean military coup at that time had overthrown the democratically elected President Salvador Allende. And so he said that we needed to become ever more cautious, vigilant, and most importantly, dedicated to the cause, because he would tell us that as a nation we were heading in the same direction. And that there would be a rapidly advancing fascist military dictatorship, and that working class folks and minorities would be rounded up and put in concentration camps, just like the Jews in Nazi Germany and the Americans of Japanese descent in this country just a generation earlier. Groups like ours, he would say, would not be immune to the oppression, but to the contrary, we would be targeted. I remember temple meetings in which footage of Auschwitz, shocking scenes of people stripped naked, some of them not much more than skin and bones, were headed for showers that emitted deadly gas rather than water. And then came the scenes of bodies being bulldozed into mass graves. So, you know, just imagine this being drummed into your consciousness. The repetition and emphasis of these things in lengthy meetings registered loud and clear within my being, branded into my core. What were we to do as individuals? How would we best face the enormity of what was coming and already beginning to happen, supposedly? For me, it meant that in full measure, and most profoundly, that my own personal value existed only to the extent that I could be of service to the cause. And so, for me, I did not really exist for myself. So basically, I grew up feeling like me, as an individual, my hopes, my dreams, my wishes, none of that mattered. And also just that my hopes, dreams, and desires were unrealistic, futile, and worst of all, selfish. It was only our own survival. It was not only our own survival that depended on it, but it was a way of honoring all people who had and were suffering from injustices all around the globe, supposedly. So we took a militant stance, and our bright blue choir dresses of the Redwood Valley days changed to long black skirts and red blouses. Men wore black and militant-looking berets. Our hands, once raised in praise and song, turned to fists raised with revolutionary fervor. We took turns in around-the-clock security shifts and all entry points and fire escapes. With all our activities and long meetings into the wee hours of the night and the security shifts, we were always exhausted. Our education in revolutionary fervor included movies like Z, The Battle of Algiers, footage on the Soviet Revolution of 1917, and the Cuban Revolution of 1959. We had a reading list that included Das Kapital, The Glass House, and writings on Joe Hill and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. We were told that wiretaps and monitoring devices were everywhere. If we had anything important to say, we should write it down rather than speak it. And so one of our favorite pastimes as kids was to take apart the telephone and try and find the wiretap. Torture was spoken of often. Jim would tell us that revolutionaries are often tortured. I can hear his words, his voice, as if it was spoken yesterday. He said, They will come after you. You cannot live these ideals without eventually being destroyed. They will torture you, but you mustn't talk. Give no information. Before too long, you will pass out from the pain and then not feel anything. You will not have spoken. You will not have given them anything. To show support for our ideals and strengthen numbers, we wrote letters to government officials, marched around the International Hotel in San Francisco in defense of senior citizens, residents who were threatened with eviction when the owners decided to sell the hotel. We demonstrated in defense of the Fresno Four, who were newsmen who were jailed for refusing to reveal their sources at a courthouse in Fresno, California. Members who were caught being frivolous, lazy, or acting selfish were embarrassed by verbal chastisement during open meetings. Some were given painful whacks or made to box with another person. Fortunately, I didn't have to experience that myself. Other punishments included procuring money on the street and extra work duties. Because of what we were being told and shown, we were in a state of perpetual readiness to defend our ideals and principles of racial and gender equality and working class pride. So, as you mentioned, I just want to emphasize that I still believe these to be worthy ideals. Yet, when I look back on it and the way we lived, the price for this on me and other young people, everyone actually, of all ages, was enormous. And it was enormous because It was enormous because while the principles were noble and good in their own right, the circumstances under which we were to exist to promote them were ironically repressive and destructive to my already underdeveloped or undeveloped and diminished sense of self as a young human creature and my own personal sense of worthiness apart from anything else. So it meant that I was to live with a cognitive dissonance between my wee small voice within and the power and control over me. Being so unacknowledged as an individual at such a fundamental level and while so young and formative resulted in a certain amount of detriment to my experience of the world in general. Even now, as I attempt to figure out which of my behaviors are post-traumatic responses and which are real and viable concerns of living in our present time, I sometimes feel handicapped by a lack of skills possibly that most people learn as teenagers and young adults. Yet I also know that because it required so much of me while I was so young, and because of the intensity of it all, including the tragic end, I believe that there has been a sort of stretching of the psyche, which has served to develop particular sensitivities and abilities and instincts that probably would not have come otherwise. So I do acknowledge the gifts that have come out of this scorching experience. For me, one of the gifts has been insight into the complexities of life. and the ability let's see. The ability to view complex and even painful situations as a process in which something new is trying to emerge. This whole experience has really helped me to look at the human story in general. And I've concluded that humans are in an infancy stage as a species. The evolutionary process of the natural world has never been neat and pretty. And everything is part of it, including the way that we humans live in groups. I believe that if we can grasp the myriad of social and psychological dynamics which were at play in the People's Temple, we're given insight into the frailties as well as the strengths of the human in general. Many of the same dynamics have been and still are at play in larger scale when we look at some of the roles of leaders in modern societies. Consider the dilemma they face as flawed human beings from whom we demand profound and far-reaching, even superhuman guidance. We as a society condemn People's Temple leadership that sent its members off to die in a Guyanese jungle. But what's the difference between that leadership and one which sends youth brimming over with gallant idealism off to die in a war in a place that they know nothing about? It's not in defense, it's just a look at our story, our larger story. Will we continue to look at People's Temple tragedy as a different sort of event? Or can we see the ways in which it is reflective of the larger macrocosm of the human story up to the present time? Will we learn how it is reflective of our level of competency of living together on a larger scale? Will the lessons learned help us on our journey to be masterful in the way of healthy living in groups and societies? The second gift of this experience has been the gift of compassion. Compassion is the ultimate pain reliever. Because whether you're happy or sad, you can still be content. I always get teary right here. Feeling compassion allows me to cope with conflict and difficult issues. Because when I feel compassion, I can drop guilt, blame, shame, anger, and all the serious snags that prevent us from continuing to grow into our potential. I really don't know how it happened, but the experience of being in People's Temple and the loss of my family, my sisters and my nephews, and hundreds of others that I was close to has given me compassion towards myself and others, including those I don't particularly like or agree with. Because we're all one and the same, each of us reflecting a different dimension or angle of where we are on the human journey. So, let's see, I have some reflections from my friends, which are pretty short. I think that, should I read them? Okay. I also have a poem that I wrote, which is pretty short too. Let's see, I'll read their reflections first and then read the poem. So this is a friend, her name is Mickey, and she says, "Hi Jordan, this is difficult to answer succinctly. My first year or so in People's Temple, I was 19 years old. It was 1970. She's a little older than I. And it was the first time I had been immersed in a black population. Excuse me. Heard about socialism and began to understand white racism. I was open, involved, and was happy. My family was there, and I made a few friends. However, I was new and unaccepted by the leadership clique of the young people. It did not change when I enrolled in Santa Rosa Junior College and lived in the Temple's duplex with that clique. Looking back, I was committing myself to the cause and looking forward to being part of bringing in a new world. Yet, I was self-conscious of who I was and felt I had to purge away my past life as a white capitalist. The message I received from the organization was that my white past was bad, and I was bad for being white. I learned how to survive within the pecking order of the dorms, to put on an act of superiority over the kids that were not popular or well-liked. I puffed myself up to be an important taker of the offering and act like I was a committed socialist. I did not realize I was trying very hard to be Mickey the strong socialist while I was losing sensitivity, family bonds, my own identity, and understanding of the psychological environment I was living in. By the time I was 21 to 22 years old, I lived in terror of being brought up, which is the term that we used for being brought up in front of everyone and chastised for something. Lived in terror of being brought up in front of everyone and being caught talking to a guy and being accused of compensating. The confrontational and ranting meetings by Jones made me feel guilty of what? I don't know. I just felt wrong and in trouble. I withdrew and stopped talking to people. I cut my hair very short, wore drab clothes so I wouldn't be attractive to guys. I longed to be liked and to belong, but I was alienated from my family and the rest of the congregation. I was very alone and scared of the Planning Commission and what would happen to me if I was caught doing something unacceptable. I was unaware, depressed, and scared, believing I was a latent homosexual because Jones said everybody was. I had no friends, and I did not talk to my family. To defend People's Temple and talk about how good it was at certain times for certain people, and some people do talk like that, makes my skin crawl. To feel the need to talk about what was positive when the leader and all of the enablers led over 1,900 humans, including 300 children, to their death, makes my skin crawl more. People's Temple was a trap. And the backbone of the trap was not only Jones, but all those who denied their own strength and allowed him to live. And then the next person that I talked to is my friend Linda. In contrast, Linda says, even though I was always getting into trouble for smoking, talking with outsiders, and falling asleep in meetings, I felt a sense of belonging and purpose. I once told on me and my brother for throwing rocks and breaking a window because I felt Jim was going to know about it, as I thought he could read our minds. And most of the kids did think that he could read. We thought he could read our minds. And it's kind of funny because when I think about it, whenever he'd walk by, I'd be like trying to not have any thoughts, or I'd be like, la 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 in my head, just trying to make my my thoughts very difficult to read. Or I do this thing that I call thought scrambling. So it was very common for kids to think that he could read our minds. Linda says, there were so many kids to be friends with and hang out with. In the valley, we were just kids being kids. I didn't do well in school because I wasn't getting enough sleep. All in all, there was so much love, and I loved living communally. One of my jobs, once we had moved to San Francisco, was to help Sammy, one of the elderly black women who had a concession stand, shop and help her make pies, gumbo, rice, and greens, which she would sell after the meetings and donate all the proceeds to the church. Even though Linda's stepmother and her father were in the temple, it was common for many of us to seek out other people as parental figures. And I did that too, because my mother really, she was not part of it. Linda continues, other tasks I had were washing buses in the valley, working in the dark room, leafleting, being on security, and asking for donations on the streets of San Francisco, which was a task that I did not like so much. So lastly, I will just share this little poem that I wrote, which is called Human Journey. No anger, no pain, other than the occasional twinge that I feel we all carry, serving to remind us that we are beings, alive with histories that keep us in alignment with greater truths. That we all live within the evolution of the larger human family, whose actions reflect the collective mindset of our species. A species whose present moment contains within its core a divine thrust forward and inevitable travesty along the way. We are on a path, perhaps halfway towards that once dreamed of utopia that is arrived at in its own time and never, ever before. A place intricately carved within me, hope of souls, ever tasting, expectant, our beautiful and errant frailty, all weaving together tapestries of textures and hues, rough and green, black and pale soft blue, quivering, embryonic, opaque. Death defies time and space. We're always dancing within dark abysmal beauty and earthen dreams, while sustained by the infusing brightness of our ecstatic presence and our eternal oneness with all that is. Thank you. So, if anyone has questions, I'd be very glad to answer.
Knowing what you know now, if you had a chance to go back again, would you?
Oh, heck no. Oh, no. Oh, maybe for one reason, and that would be to speak up and talk about what's wrong.
Was it 9 years that you're involved in?
Yes.
During your 9 years, do you remember any point, not outwardly, questioning Joan's leadership, but in your own mind? Or did you remember seeing anyone outwardly question Joan's leadership?
I think there were a few people that did it indirectly, not just, outright, but maybe around in a roundabout way. And no, I didn't.
You didn't at all?
In my mind, I probably did. But, you know, if you don't speak up, after a while, that little voice inside just gets smaller and smaller, and then you don't hear it anymore.
Do you remember exactly where you were when you found out that Jonestown came to an end? Like what you were doing?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was at the house in the Capitol, and there was a woman who was very close in the leadership who was on the radio, and there was radio contact between Georgetown and Jonestown. And she received the orders that all of us, that what was happening there, and that all of us who were at the house were to do the same thing. We didn't have poison, and we were far enough removed that we wouldn't even think of doing anything like that. However, this woman took her two small children and her older daughter, who was my friend Leanne, who actually was the first person that I had met when I joined the temple, and she was like my main friend. She took her two children and her older daughter Leanne upstairs to the bathroom and killed them and herself. So that she followed the orders, and told us on the way going to do this that we were to do that too, and we did not. So after that, the police came, the National Guard came and surrounded the house for like a month, as those of us that were there were finally released one by one by the government, because they were trying to figure out, you know, what was going on, and the U.S. was conducting their investigation as well, and so those of us that survived, it took time for us to actually be able to come back home.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So how many people were in the house that you talk about?
I don't know the exact number, but it was probably around 35 or 40. Anyone else?
As a member of the PC for a period of time, what was your relationship with Jim Jones like?
Well, because I was so young, I thought that he knew what was best. And now, you know, I think back on it, and I'm just like so amazed at how we're really affected as young people, and that was like these were like my parental figures, because my parents weren't there, and so I believed that what he was doing and saying was the right thing. And I didn't really know anything else before that much, and so there was a way in which it was kind of normal when that's kind of all you know, you know.
Relatedly, did other people in the PC, like Maria Katsaris and Carolyn Layton, did they also serve as kind of parental enablers of just fulfilling what you should be doing?
Yes, yes. In fact, the person, Maria, that you're talking to, was put on PC the same evening that I was. We were both called back. Mm-hmm.
So the first thing I want to say is that I think you sharing your reflections is really generous.
Thank you.
And I can only imagine the complexity of sort of feelings and thoughts that goes with that kind of sharing. And I also wanted to say I really like the way that you are thinking about compassion and empathy. And I wanted to ask you about something that I'm imagining you've reflected a lot on and that you referred to a little bit when you were talking, which is the relationship between individual selves and the collective. And, you shared that you thought that that really went awry in Jonestown. And I'm wondering, you've seen a lot of other models for that. I wonder how you envision a good relationship between the individual and the collective.
Well, I think it's really important to have a healthy balance of both. And to always, always know what it is that you really, really feel and what's really, really true for you, no matter what. And then from that place you can, have the community, be in community of your choice, where you are, standing in your own center, as well as participating in that community. So just a really good, healthy balance, I think, is really important. Did that answer that question?
I was actually thinking also, like, on the larger scale, what would a society that had that good balance look like?
I think we're far away. We're in the process, but I think we're still learning.
How was your adjustment when you came back to the United States then from being in Jonestown? Was it very difficult to acclimate yourself back to a so-called normal life?
Well, as I said, I didn't really even know who I was, and that's just taking a long time still. I think that when you're growing up, there's really important points where you get something, and if you don't get it, then it's sort of like language. If you learn a language, like a foreign language or a language, like before you're 3, then you get that. And I think that's the same way in your development too. So when I came back, I had bad relationships with guys because I didn't have much of self-esteem, and I did some partying, and I went to school, and I was in school a lot, and then finally got my BA and then a master's much later. So yeah, it was about discovering who I was, what the world is, that it's not as dangerous as we were told. That that sure it's dangerous, but the way that I was taught was it's just really, really bad, and that if you're not in a group like People Symbol, that you had little hope for survival. I mean, that was the mentality, so it was unlearning all of that.
I know you talked about finding parental figures in People's Temple. Did you, when you came back to the United States, did you reconnect with your mother, and how was that?
I did, and my family was waiting for me, and it's been very difficult for my mother because she allowed me to join, and she lost her grandkids and my 2 sisters. And one of my sisters she had brought down 2 weeks before it happened. So considering all of that, she's doing really well. She's 93 right now and pretty active. But parental figures, came back to my family, and my parents were divorced, but they were both still alive. And I had, at that time, 3 brothers. 2 have since died, and so now it's just me and 1 brother.
In this 35-year period since then, the healing process for you, the development process for you, how important a role with the other survivors, the survivor community that we've been hearing about and reading about? How important was that for you in these years?
It's been really important because, well, first of all, there was a long period of time when most people did not have contact with one another because there was a lot of guilt and shame and even some fear about what it meant to be, connected with the group, and just an emotional thing too. But over time, and as it happened to me, after 25 years, I started slowly, I would go to the memorials on the day, and I would see people that I hadn't seen for a long time, that I had spent so much time with, and it was like really great to see them. We had this common past that, that we shared and that we don't have with anyone else. And so even though we have different opinions and feelings about different things, there's still this common bond. And so every year someone kind of comes out of the woodwork that we haven't seen for a long time, and it's good. It's good. Okay.
You mentioned a couple things that were really interesting to me as you were talking. One was the idea that Jones had that there was latent homosexuality in everyone, and the other was about race, and in particular, at least the one individual who felt like as a white person there was an inherent problem with being a white person. And on the other hand, the official message, at least, was about gender equality and racial equality. And so I'm wondering what that actually looked like on the ground with the People's Temple and in Jonestown.
Okay. With regard to the first question about homosexuality, I didn't know it at the time, but Jim was bisexual, and I think that he was ashamed of that and had issues with that, and so because of that, he had to make everyone else that too. So he would say that guys were homosexual and that women were lesbians. Whether it was true or not, we had to admit that. And I think, one, it was a way of keeping control and just kind of like, pushing us down in a sense, if that was not true for us, right? Then.
But somehow also you were, at least as young people, not supposed to have romantic or sexual relationships that were heterosexual, and then the other piece is race.
Okay, so first of all, if you did have a relationship, whether it was hetero or otherwise, you were seen as not quite as dedicated as you should be, because Jim would, kind of go on about, oh, all you people are just like, thinking about sex, and that's all you think about, and the cause is like the most important thing. And so if you were in a relationship at all, you were that was kind of considered not so great. And if you were in one, it was okay, but you weren't as dedicated. And so the way that I took that on was I wasn't in a relationship with anybody, because I didn't have my parents there, and the leadership was like my parental sort of structure. I decided that I was not going to be in a relationship, and I could be seen as really dedicated. So as far as the race thing, it's so complex. Jim would favor black people, but yet his inner staff, his innermost circle was all white. So go figure. I mean, it was weird. It was weird. And probably when his son Stephen comes here next month, I guess, he'll be able to explain more about that. It's interwoven with complexity that I'm not sure I could, that I know, but I'm not sure I could like totally articulate it in the best way. But I think he could. Anything else?
This is a strange question. You may or may not know the answer to it, but everyone was, from the reading, seemed to be a big family when they were all together, and then when the tragedy occurred, and there were survivors, obviously, in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and where you were in Georgetown, did anyone try to still keep the initial group mentality going, or did everyone just split their ways? It just seems so, from looking inward, it looks like it would be so lonely and fearful for those people, because as soon as that happened, it seemed that everybody just kind of fell away from each other. And I would think there'd be some person that would say, hey, let's stay together still as this group. But it didn't seem to be the case.
No. I think in San Francisco, I wasn't there, but I think there may have been some amount of that initially, because the people that were still in San Francisco were far enough away, and they didn't see on a day-to-day basis how things had kind of deteriorated, and he had kind of just gone downhill so fast. And so in San Francisco, there was still this everything was as it was, and so I think it was in some ways harder for the people that had not gone down to Guyana to really take it in right away that it was over.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I was just going to ask, what did you not initially like about Jonestown? You said you went there.
Well, it was just so different. There was a crew leader, and he seemed really, in a way, kind of manic and just like really harsh. And I didn't like that. It was difficult for me, and that was the main thing. It was like, okay, so what is, I couldn't figure out what I was going to be really doing, because everyone, when you first went down there, you had to work in the field. That was just like what you did at first. It was kind of what you just had to do. And then slowly you'd be, given other jobs and tasks. So I didn't like the feeling. I found a way to be away.
About your college degree and your studies in grad school, how did your choice of studies reflect your journey? How did that reflect your journey?
Well, the place where I went for my BA, I got to utilize a portion of my story as for credits. And that was really therapeutic for me to be able to validate my experience and use it academically. And then most recently, I received my master's at Holy Names at the school there is called the Sophia Center. And its work is based on the work of Thomas Berry, who's a theologian, ecologian. I don't know if you know of him, but I was really inspired by Thomas Berry and the work that they were doing there. So, does that answer your question?
You had mentioned drugs in Jim Jones before. Do you think the drugs had any part in the deterioration of Jonestown?
Absolutely. I think that he was so self-centered, and we really couldn't have known just how much he was. Only, looking back, it became clear to me that his whole identity was wrapped up in people being committed to him. And that's why it was a problem for people when people left. They became a traitor. It was like, in normal circumstances, people can leave. People should be able to leave, do whatever they want, right? But for him, he considered it like a threat to his own being, which was a self-centeredness that is quite unusual. But the drugs definitely had an effect
Were
on.
drugs rampant among everybody, or?
Oh no, him. And like I said, I wasn't in Jonestown much toward the end, but people said that he was slurring a lot. We had microphones, or not microphones, but speakers all over Jonestown, and so you could hear him ranting on and on for hours sometimes, and he would slur. And so people probably suspected it. But among the people, we weren't taking drugs. Now, since then, I've heard that some people were drugged if they had, if they were dissenting, if they, were complaining or speaking up.
Do you ever think about what you would have done if you were there that last night?
I haven't had that thought for a long time, but I have thought that. And to answer it, I think that I probably would have died. For sure I would have died. There was something about the way that it was done. The kids went first. Excuse me. Kids went first. That would be enough to kind of like do it for me. I mean, not that I would, want to do it or anything like that, but just that feeling of that was constantly drummed into us about there being no hope on the outside. A pretty poor diet, lack of sleep, all these things have an effect on how you think and just your general, your mood and your sense of hope for things. And so I think that if anyone that, put up a fight probably would have been given an injection. And I imagine there were probably people, I don't know, but there probably were people that weren't so willing.
According to the other speaker, you kind of had dress rehearsals for the suicide.
Mm-hmm.
Did you take any of those practice runs, so to speak?
Well, no. There was something that happened like that in Redwood Valley even.
Right.
Way before that, and somehow we just didn't connect it that this is where he was headed all along, that he had this obsession with death and with power, and I think that he obsessed it, but we didn't get it. We didn't fully comprehend the extent that he was. So there had been some situations like he told us that there were mercenaries in the jungle and that they were coming to get us. And so we would surround the property and with machetes in our hands in case they were to come in. And I remember standing there at one of these and thinking to myself, this is so ridiculous. And of course, I wouldn't say that to anybody because I didn't want to get turned in. But I remember thinking, this is fake. There's nobody out there, So, yeah.
The one lady said that she was so happy that night she came home, she wasn't dead. One of the readings. Saying, she practiced it, she said, oh, I was so thankful I came home. But she went through this dry run, and it was in California. It was like,
yeah, I think, I don't remember everything because I was so young, but I think even in one of the PC meetings, he gave us something to drink, told us it was poison, and then wanted to see our reactions. And so there was a grooming for it. Yeah.
yeah.
Sure.
I was intrigued by what you said about, this is my interpretation of what you said, that, Jonestown seems like such a bizarre circumstance. And yet my sense from what you said is that it resonates all over the place. It's not so bizarre. It's about how human beings are and can be, and we see this in lots of ways, in lots of places, and lots of times. And just thinking about the back and forth that just happened about his self-centeredness and this combination of death and power. I was wondering if you've given any thought to the resonances between that incident and some of the school shootings that are also homicides, suicides, combinations in recent years. Have you thought about connections there?
Well, I hadn't, but I think, kind of as a nation, that's one of our afflictions. Power, control. Of course, not with everyone, but it's there. But I hadn't really thought about a connection between that and Jonestown or Jim Jones.
But I do see the connection between Jim Jones and David Koresh and the Hell Bops and the Adolf Hitlers. I mean, if you look at all these Looney Tunes, they all pull the same thing. And these guys all running the same gamut, and they see it, and, it just repeats itself.
Mm-hmm. And the thing about it is, as well, is that there are these people that are really, really charismatic, and just because you're charismatic doesn't mean you're a good person, or, and also that in one individual you can have a completely different dynamic going on. It's not like, he was really totally bad or totally good. I saw ways in which I could see, especially early on, some compassion that he had for some elderly people, and humans can feel, and so there was this element there, and yet there was this other side that was just completely overshadowed all that. That was completely self-centered, completely power hungry, and all of that, which is so interesting. And again, I think that his son will be able to shed some light on that as well.
I forgot Charlie
Manson, too. Was there any point where, I'm sure you still kind of missed your mom after she stopped going to these meetings and you still wanted to go? Like, what made you still keep going and staying there, and what made you totally convert from your mother as your family figure to the People's Temple as your family?
My mother sent me to live with my sister.
Oh.
And so I didn't, she wasn't, I think on some level I just interpreted that as her caring for me in her own way. And so I accepted that. And I was in a community. Early on, it was not as bad as it was later on. And there was a time when I guess I was there for 2 or 3 years, and my mother was living in Mexico. And she wanted me to come visit. And so I did want to come, but I was really conflicted because I felt like if I did go, I was being bad. I was leaving the cause, and I was doing something wrong. And so I went up to Jim after one of the meetings to ask permission to go. And he said, well, if you really have to go, you can go. And I just felt even worse then. But I went. I went and I visited her for like 2 weeks. And it was great. But inside I was conflicted because I felt like I was doing something wrong.
I wondered what your perception was of Carolyn Moore.
Well, Carolyn, Carolyn was my French teacher at Ukiah High. She was always kind of mysterious to me. Obviously, the closest person to Jim. Sometimes she would disappear. Yeah, once it was to have a child. But at the time, I just saw her as a dedicated person. Is that what you're?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And since then, I know so much more because I know her sister, Rebecca, and I was also friends with their other sister who died. But okay. So thank you.